course, now video games have had a very heavy cinematic influence, with utilizing cinematography for cutscenes and atmosphere, full orchestras for soundtracks, and even hiring talent from the film industry. Games strive to enhance the cinematic experience in and outside of its gameplay. This all started with the introduction of the Laserdisc in the early 1980s, which allowed for increased graphic quality and storage space. Though this was still at a time that games and gaming in general was in its infancy. Games were very simple, but the release of the Laserdisc allowed games to expand beyond the top-down pixel-friendly they were at the time. One of the earliest games that utilized the Laserdisc and really innovated beyond its competition was Defender of the Crown. This game attempted to use movie-like graphics, and while dated to today's standards, this was at a time that games were still quite primitive. Defender of the Crown also had spectacular sound, especially with the hardware limitations of 16-bit computers in the 80s, which really made it stand out among the public. Another gaming series that is held in high regard is Metal Gear Solid. The first game developed by Konami was named Metal Gear and is often recognized as one of the first stealth games produced, and the series is often recognized as paving the way for stealth games in general. Metal Gear was produced for the MSX2 home computer and was released in 1987. The game then spawned two following sequels, and Konami began development on a third canonical installment titled Metal Gear 3. Now, Metal Gear 3 was intended to release on the 3DO interactive multiplayer console, but due to the lack of support for the 3DO and the declining titles on the console, development was changed to the new and popular PlayStation console. Then, in 1998, Konami released Metal Gear Solid to the world, and this not only spawned an abundance of sequels, but also one of the most popular gaming franchises in history. While multiple other titles before Metal Gear Solid had cutscenes and contained interesting characters and worlds, Metal Gear Solid had the aim of bringing the cinematic experience beyond just its cutscenes and graphics, and while it isn't a very convincing attempt to today's standards, this game was a huge improvement over many other titles that released around the same time. Another thing that really sets Metal Gear Solid apart from its competitors is how it went about doing this. Most games utilized graphic fidelity and music to convey a cinematic tone, but on top of all this, Metal Gear Solid also breaks the fourth wall. In most situations, characters in the game will address or directly talk to the player, which to some it may nullify the immersion, but in my personal opinion, it's why I enjoyed the game so much. Unlike a lot of other games, the player felt like a third entity, like they were physically involved in what was going on in the game, and that can have a powerful effect. Unfortunately, that same treatment doesn't extend to its gameplay. It's not that the gameplay and mechanics are bad, they just don't share the same influence and care that the cutscenes do. This is a problem that plagued the gaming community for a long time, and I shouldn't use the word plague as it's a worthy goal, but for years developers just couldn't hit the dot with this one. Bringing the cinematic experience beyond its cutscenes isn't a simple task. It's one that requires not only atmosphere and relatable characters, but also synchronization between player and protagonist and unity with the world around you. Games are made to be experiences, some enjoyable, others not so much. But how a game utilizes the player will often affect how immersed the player would be in the world. People often associate immersion with the cinematic experience. This isn't always true though, as the cinematic experience comes with not just being immersed in the world, but being as invested in the world as the characters are. This comes back around to synchronization between player and protagonist. To be as invested as the character you're portraying only adds to how cinematic the game feels to you, as if you're seeing a cutscene that you can control. But to be invested, you have to care in the first place. Writing a story with memorable characters and events is a challenge in of itself, but to write one where the player feels like they are one with the protagonist is even more difficult. This is what a developer by the name of Naughty Dog set out to do. Bringing the cinematic experience beyond their cutscenes was a goal set by many developers at the time, but none had as much success as Naughty Dog did with their post-apocalyptic sandbox, The Last of Us. While the maps and levels are designed to be linear, there are a handful of choices as to how you can tackle a mission. This is mostly due to the wide varieties of enemies, most notably the infected. Due to the various types of infected and the fact that the player can interact with the environment around them, the game has a much more cinematic feel to it. This is also due to the fact that since the game is a sandbox in many ways, for example, any mistake is your fault, and when you die, there's always that knowledge that you could have done something slightly different to prevent your death. And thanks to the excellent AI and well-crafted levels, deaths in The Last of Us never feel cheap or unfair. Something else I feel this game displays excellently is that your story doesn't need to be complex to be good, or in this case, great. While I know a lot of you will disagree with me, The Last of Us story does draw a lot of inspiration from other pieces of media before it. Besides zombie apocalypse media being oversaturated in the past few decades, a story based around an individual being immune to the initial disease that needs to be taken from point A to B to create a vaccine isn't a very original plot, especially within this genre, as there are so many different interpretations of this exact kind of story. The thing that makes this game unique isn't just because it's clearly more cinematic and just a better experience than, say, the Left 4 Dead franchise. Sorry, Valve. But also just how real and authentic the story feels. The Last of Us feels like an accurate depiction of an event like this. These characters, their interactions and motivations all feel real to us. Something that also helps this is the great length that Naughty Dog went to keep the story authentic. Like the fact that the virus is based off a real disease that affects insects. But I'm not going to dwell on that too much, as I feel it strides away from the initial topic. Games have been utilizing talent from the film industry for quite a while now, but it wasn't until Naughty Dog that these elements were brought in and used properly. Though I've been mostly giving credit to The Last of Us for a majority of this video, the Uncharted series also uses these elements quite well. This got me wondering why The Last of Us received so much more attention than the Uncharted series. Now, this is only my opinion based off my experience with both games, but I feel like The Last of Us has a much stronger connection with people due to the relatable father-daughter relationship between Joel and Ellie. These characters aren't just humanized themselves, their interactions are further humanized because of the dynamic between the two of them, and this dynamic isn't seen nearly as much in Nathan Drake's adventures. Of course, both Uncharted and The Last of Us are a part of the same genre, as they're both linear third-person action-adventure games that utilize a progression and upgrading system as well as a cover-to-cover system to keep engagement strategic and harsh. Now, while both these games have cinematic elegance and influence, imagine adapting all of these elements into a shooter, open world, or even a strategy game. A shooter, for the most part, would be the next best candidate for conveying a cinematic tone, but I actually want to touch on an open world game for a minute, as I feel they're the most interesting to talk about since they require the most speculation. Open world games such as Grand Theft Auto, The Witcher, and even The Division all allow for players to carve out their own experience, letting players level up at their own pace, completing missions in whatever order they see fit, or even just roaming the streets of the world. Open world games don't normally have any set rules as to how they can be completed. This means the developers have to account for many different variables rather if they are working on a linear story-driven game instead. This is the main reason story tend to take a back seat in a lot of these kind of titles. Not because it isn't possible, but because of the many different outcomes that a story in open world RPG could have. Thus, developers opt to make the story universally identical despite the choices and character traits you develop along the way. This harms the overall story in multiple ways. For one, the story may come to a conclusion that doesn't match the traits or personality you've developed for your character, thus breaking all cinematic flair and tension. For another, forcing a story among a game that the developers don't intend to flesh out or make believable doesn't really need to exist in the first place. This same problem extends to strategy games as well. Not only is characterization hard to properly incorporate with this type of game, there's always distinct detachment between you and the world. Now, this isn't really a problem unless the developers are attempting to convey a unified or immersive experience. The detachment comes in the player not being characterized, and while this isn't always a problem, when it comes to a game advertising a single-player campaign, it will more often than not be a scripted point-and-click simulator, which I feel goes against the strategy game's initial design. For me, the fun of strategy games comes when you must outsmart your enemy, on your own, not with an on-screen prompt assisting you every step of the way. This only adds to the sandbox potential of a strategy game, given the player can create freedom within the map and it allows players to make mistakes themselves, and it makes each and every playthrough a unique experience. This comes in the same context of how The Last of Us made their levels operate more like a sandbox, while still being linear. The same can be done with strategy games, albeit with different variables, but it's possible nonetheless. Now back onto the topic of shooters, these type of games have the most potential to have a cinematic experience in and out of its cutscenes. A lot of games have achieved the former, but not the latter. Titanfall 2 is the best exception to this. Now, while the story isn't much to chew on, the game is a perfect example of how you don't need to have a polished story for the game to have a cinematic feel. Titanfall 2 enhances its gameplay by evolving the character relationship between Cooper and BT. The player is also allowed to directly choose lines of dialogue, which, like The Last of Us, allows players to be involved and in sync with the protagonist. And this only further humanizes the relationship between the two. I feel like a lot of developers of this genre could learn a lot from Titanfall 2's approach and execution. Creating a cinematic experience within a video game can be done with any title no matter what genre, style, or direction it's being taken in. A side-scrolling game can feel just as polished as a shooter, not just in the graphics, but also in how genuine and realistic the experience feels. This extends beyond just the writing and gameplay, but also to the acting and the dialogue's delivery. For cutscenes nowadays, they mostly use motion capture, and while this comes with a lot of added benefits as animators don't have to strive to make movements feel natural, all the weight falls onto the actors now, and with a lack of direction and experience, things can come off as very flat and unnatural. When done correctly, the finished product could be of the quality of feature films and in some cases beyond that. Naughty Dog has always been successful with utilizing the elements in their games to expand the initial experience beyond its gameplay. While video games themselves don't feel like movies, their cutscene stories and characters are of the writing you would come to expect in a feature film, and that's exactly what a fellow developer by the name of Ubisoft set out to do. To create an experience that mimics the gameplay of your title while containing all the heart and compelling narrative that you come to expect from a feature film is a task easier said than done. Not even to mention how some games just aren't compatible with the format of a film. Actually, now if I think about it, if Battleship can be converted into a movie, then anything can. But that movie sucked. Not even to mention the Warcraft movie, but that one also kind of sucked. And don't even get me started on Doom 2005 because screw that movie. I don't know what that movie was trying to be. I don't know what the crew was smoking. Maybe Andres Bartekewak snuck a little weed on set and shared it among the crew. The point is, video game movies haven't had a very good track record, and Ubisoft set out to change that with the release of Assassin's Creed. Long story short, they failed in a dramatic fashion. It's kind of hard to believe that Assassin's Creed failed. It had all the necessary assets to be a good film. The performances were all great, the cinematography was top notch, and the soundtrack was good. What the movie suffered from was a lack of direction and poor writing. And when I say poor writing, a film shouldn't rely on the audience having past knowledge or experience with the franchise. Because of this, the movie doesn't have much narrative direction. The writers attempt to make up with this through dialogue, but this has the effect of sounding like the actors are blatantly informing the audience rather than having an actual interaction among themselves, which is exactly what's going on. You have to give the actors credit though, because their performances are great, despite what they had to work with. Now, I don't want to use this video to kick the crap out of Ubisoft and Assassin's Creed, but I do think the subject is old and tired at this point, but there are some really interesting parallels to draw here. I feel like the fact that The Last of Us offers a more pure and cinematic experience than the Assassin's Creed movie is probably the most interesting. It's not because the Assassin's Creed movie isn't entertaining, because it was. I was entertained. I think it's because of the lack of character development and humanity compared to The Last of Us. Naughty Dog had a lot of experience utilizing film talent, and they understand how to apply that talent to their content to improve it. If anybody is to make the successful jump from game to film, I feel like Naughty Dog will be the best candidate to do it. And with all the rumors and leaks of the Uncharted movie in progress, I'm excited to see what plans Naughty Dog has for the future.